Okay. This is then especially important when you're dealing with images that have sort of hard to estimate properties and where your experiments are very, very time consuming. So for those of you who are working at sort of like SLS, and you're using sort of the Tomcat beamline, you have one beam time every 6 months, sometimes one beam time every year, and you don't want to be tweaking parameters during the beam time that you could have figured out beforehand. And so this allows you to sort of plan what you want to do and how you want to acquire efficiently before that actually happens. In biology, this is even more critical. So if you're dealing with live animals like mice, you need to decide before you start the experiments, when you're going to take the images, how often you're going to take, what resolution you're going to take them at. And if you make a wrong decision and can't track the results, then you might have 6 months or 12 months of data that are completely useless. And furthermore, you sort of sacrificed a bunch of animal lives for something you couldn't realistically accomplish. And so being able to make your experiments well is quite important. Obviously, if you're dealing with cells in a microscope and it takes you 10 minutes to do an experiment and you can do 50 experiments a day, then you don't need as much consideration when you design them. But it's still helpful to be able to sort of come up with these metrics and have an idea of what you're trying to track and how accurately you can do it. And so in terms of kind of how much is enough, it's kind of very difficult to come up with one number for each experiment. And so if you look at this bubble flow example, that's sort of a 5% error in bubble position. And so if we're able to get the accuracy of the bubble position and track it within 5% error, then this is actually a less than 5% error in the flow field. So we actually get a much better result for the field because we're able to average out. And mostly the error in our systems tends to cancel out as you average out over more samples. But if you're now trying to calculate topology, and so if you want to look at each bubble and track what its neighbors are and how it rearranges, then a 5% error in the position can easily be a greater than 20% error in the topology. And so when you're trying to figure out what accuracy you need, then clearly for flow field, it's fairly low. You're able to do quick, dirty experiments. But for topology, it's incredibly high. And so if you want to be able to track that reliably, you'll need to have samples that are moving very slowly or where the changes between images are very low so that your reconstruction accuracy is very high. Similarly, with 5% error in shape or volume, this tends to lead, to a 5% error in sort of distribution or sort of shape tensors. More than 5% error typically in individual bubble changes because you have sort of 5% error from time 0 and 5% error at time 1. And so that can sort of double the amount of error you have or the potential for error you have. And then often more than 15% error for, if you're trying to calculate strain or deformation of bubbles, that gets amplified because you're now looking at changes in volume across all the different sort of axes. And so you'll have sort of very inaccurate measurements for this. And so again, if you're looking at sort of your whole system and you're averaging over that, then it's probably fine. But when you start to do more complicated metrics like deformation, then it becomes a lot more difficult. And also with the experiment design, nearest neighbors seems like a very simple tracking method to use, just finding the nearest one. But it's actually a great starting point, and it allows you to build experiments that even if your simulations aren't quite perfectly matching what your real data look like, you can always make your tracking method better. And if you start off using the most advanced tracking method you have, then it might be the case that you underestimated how much noise was in the data or how reliable your measurements would be. And now you're not able to sort of improve your tracking method because you're already picking the best one. And so you should use a very simple method when you're designing your experiments and doing the simulations with the knowledge that you can always improve your tracking method later to get better results. And sort of the simplest way to improve it is this sort of bijective requirement, where you basically say a bubble has to be tracked the same way in both directions. And so if you go forward in time or backward in time, it should give you exactly the same bubble or object or cell, whatever you're looking at. Similarly, maximum displacement says that you only track objects that move less than a certain distance. And so by knowing your average and standard deviation of what you'd expect, you can easily put a hard upper limit on how much you're willing to track an object. Extending nearest neighbor, of course, gets even sort of easily much more complicated. And so here you can sort of have prior or expected movement. And so if you already know what your flow field is supposed to be, then you can put that in as sort of your V offset term as you calculate the minimum. And then adaptive movement is where you kind of you perform a tracking, you take the average, and then you perform the tracking again using the average as the offset. And you can perform this in sort of an iterative manner to get better and better results, where your nearest neighbors are closer and closer to where they should be. You can then, of course, get much more complicated with sort of multiple hypothesis testing, where you sort of will test multiple possible trajectories for each point. And then you'll use a criteria to try to figure out which of those is the best choice. So which are you able to track longest? Which one has the fewest sort of rapid, violent movements in it? And sort of merging and splitting particles. And so if you have a system where particles are splitting and coming back together, then you need a much more complicated model than this, because nearest neighbors probably won't give you very good results. And so there you'll need to have some idea of how frequently particles are splitting and what's exactly happening to them. And so now we'll sort of transition to kind of the image or voxel-based approaches, where we use sort of these correlation techniques in order to try to actually figure out where the images overlap best, rather than tracking one point in one image to one point in the other image. And so if we sort of given an image I0 and I1 at times T0 and T1, we can calculate the correlation between these images as sort of the correlation of I0, I1 at distance or vector r is the average of sort of this I0 image and this I1 image offset by that position r. And so, we can have a fairly simple example where we have this 5 sort of in the middle, and then we have a 5 shifted up. And what we can do is sort of calculate all the possible different overlaps that these images can have, and calculate sort of the mean value of that image when you perform this overlap. And so here we shift that image by all the different possible values and calculate sort of the overlap for each one of those offset points. And so now we have kind of a score for each offset value, and we can look at this and try to figure out which one is the maximum score that means the highest overlap between the two images. And so we can see here that there's a number of points that are fairly high, but it's quite clear that this one is the maximum. So this is where those images overlap the most. What we also see is that this metric sort of isn't really perfect, because this is 10.5 and this is quite far off. And this is only 13.4, and these are kind of perfectly matching. And so this is sort of what we call kind of a this would be sort of a local maximum, where it gives you a reasonably good result, but it's definitely not the best match you can have. And so this isn't the best approach we can use, but it's very easy to visualize and look at, and gives us, at least for this fairly simple example, the right answer. So we can also use sort of mean squared error or root mean squared error. And so there we can sort of look at the differences between the points. So we take, rather than the correlation, we have sort of the I0 at x minus I1 at x plus r, and we do the same exact analysis. And so we shift the images across, and we calculate sort of the root mean squared error, or the mean squared error of the differences. And what's quite nice here is that we have a super clear optimum value, where it's 0.0 and everything else is 22, 23, 24. And so this makes it very easy for us to kind of pick the best point and gives us fairly reasonable results. And so now to kind of transition, using this example is fairly easy. As we can see, these images are in fact exactly the same. One is just a shifted version of the other one. And so we'd expect them to be able to match perfectly. But of course, real images are more complicated and aren't just sort of black and white. They have sort of much more ranges of colors. And so here we'll use sort of this bone filtered image, where we have sort of the image at time 0 and the image at time 1. And so there's some kind of shift between these two images, and we want to try to register them together. And so here we can look at kind of a zoomed in version of the image where it's looking at all of these pixels, not immediately obvious how you would line them up perfectly. So it's not just sort of a clear, simple shift, or it's a large enough shift that you're not able to see it inside these two sort of zoomed in regions of this image here. And so I think we take 20 to 30 and 210 to 2, yeah, so somewhere around here, I guess. And we just sort of compare those two regions. And so here we can perform kind of the same sort of analysis where we shift the one image around and we compute, in this case, the mean squared error between these two images. And so we use sort of that same metric from before, and now we're sort of looking for that minimum value. And so we shift across and sort of see how the values change as we run through all these different iterations. And we can find that sort of across this whole grid of points, here we had a fairly narrow grid, so from minus 10 to 10, and none of them were sort of clear winners. And that as we expand that grid from sort of minus 20 to 20, we now see that there's a point where the images overlap best. And it's still not a perfect overlap, but it's fairly close. And so we're able to get to the point where we can kind of see one of these points is significantly different from all the others, and that gives us a reasonable kind of starting point for lining up. Yeah?
So this is something like a convolution map on the right, and then a convolution and some additional analysis like RMS or average.
Right, yeah. So you're basically just sliding one image over the other.
Yeah.
So there's no so the kernel for the convolution is image 1, and the input is image 0. Yeah. And so yeah, this is then just picking whatever metric you do over it. But yeah, it can be a convolution or any number of different sort of after processing operators on it. Yeah.
So now those two images are fairly similar. What if they differ more? Which method performs better in that case, like the mean squared error or the correlation-based method?
So it depends a lot on how they differ.
Say you, I don't know, you have a different intensity scaling, or I don't know, if it moves out of focus or something like that.
So if you have different intensity scaling, like that's then clearly one where sort of correlation will work much better than mean squared error, because if you have sort of a fixed offset, you'll never get that kind of 0 or perfect match. And you wouldn't want it to score it better just because the intensity happened to be closer, even though the values were very different. But each one of these techniques works better and worse in sort of different situations. And so that's why I think it might not be in this week yet. Is it? Oh, where did it go? Okay. Well, in the exercises, and I guess it hasn't been incorporated. Demonstration. Hmm? It's on the so I might have to update the course website, but I thought it was already on here. Oh, yeah. So there's a registration tutorial. Huh. I don't know how that didn't get copied over from last year's site, but that should, I'll add that to the one from a student in the Institute of Biomechanics that they gave as part of a summer school that we sort of included here. It's potentially easier to have as a notebook. Yeah, where they have some sample images taken from microscopy setups, and you can basically change the metric you use, how you calculate the correlation, and then they have some sort of interactive tools you can run to try to come up with the best result. And so this one just uses SciPy optimize, so like fmin search, in order to find sort of the minimum of the least squared. And here you can kind of interactively tweak it in order to see how well it works for these images, and you can also replace it with your own images and see how well that works. But yeah, so for all of these different techniques, coming up with a metric is quite important to getting sort of a really good result. And so if you use mean squared error, on these images it makes sense because you're looking at quantitative images where the value in the image is the absorption density of the material, and so that's sort of correlated with, if it's bone, it's going to be much higher than if it's air or water, and that you wouldn't expect to change from measurement to measurement. You'd expect to be exactly the same or at least very similar. But of course, if you're dealing with things where it's like a light microscopy image and your light gets brighter and darker, then a mean squared error won't give you a very good result. Then sort of more difficult tasks. Here's sort of an example from one of the public data sets from the NIH in the US, where they've made 100,000 X-rays scans sort of publicly available. And that here we have the same person over, I think, 10 years in different sort of X-rays of their chest at different points in time. And you can see sometimes the image is brighter and darker. There's sort of clips that are moving around the body based on kind of what their most recent surgery was. But the general features stay the same. They also have whatever that fork thing was in their chest. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. But they have cables moving around and everything else. And of course, what you'd want to be able to track are things like, how have their lungs changed? How have their hearts changed, independent of everything else? And so one of the main steps you'd have for this is you want to be able to line up all of these images on the same scale so that you can actually track how those features are changing with time and if there's sort of anything important and new coming into the images. And so these data sets are quite nice because you have a huge number of patients that have been to the hospital very frequently that you can start to analyze and look for differences in. It's also a fairly tricky problem because even though these are X-rays, because they're projections, the absorption values aren't that quantitative because they could be going through the body at a slightly different angle. They could be different machines, have slightly different energies. Some of them are done on film, some of them are done digitally. And so you'll have kind of the intensity values will be changing quite a bit from patient to patient. And so one of the exercises will deal with this data set and trying to register those images. And so kind of the process for doing this that we'll go through kind of applies to a number of different tools. So has anyone used ITK before?
Is it the same thing as MITK?
It's different. Yeah, I think MITK includes ITK tools in it, but ITK is a bit lower level for that. So ITK is sort of this image analysis package, originally just in C++, but now it's in Python and R. And so we'll use, I think, simple ITK in these examples, but ITK is just a more complicated version of that. And it's basically a set of tools that are kind of used everywhere in medicine. And so kind of every CT scanner, MRI device, ultrasound scanner that you run into today probably has ITK code in it somewhere. And so it's kind of the core set of image processing algorithms that's used in the medical field. And there are examples of where it's used elsewhere, but it's primarily in that area. And so what we're going to cover here is kind of the process for how you go from sort of images and kind of references to matching and registering at the end. And so basically, we'll use the notation that ITK has. And so when you look in here, we have a fixed image, a moving image, some sort of transform, and some sort of optimizer. And so we'll have that as the fixed image is the reference that you're trying to match the image to. The moving image is what you're sort of deforming. And the transform is how you map the input image to the moving image. And so if we look at what we did here, the transform was fairly simple. The transform was just shifting these images across, moving across sort of 1 pixel at a time, going through the whole image. The optimizer was just looking for the minimum, and so it wasn't actually a smart optimizer at all. It was just going through all possible combinations. And the fixed image was sort of image 0, and the moving image was image 1. And so we have kind of this fairly basic approach where we take the moving image, the transform, and the interpolator. We take the fixed image, and then we take a metric, and sort of we compare it. And so for a given transform and parameter set, we get a certain score on our least squared error or correlation or whatever metric we decide to use. What ITK kind of adds to this is that you have this whole kind of optimization loop. So that rather than going through all possible parameters, you use an optimizer to pick your kind of parameters and optimize your transform, get your result, and give feedback, and then you update your optimizer to get a better result. And so you kind of follow along pathways that give you better and better results rather than just blindly looking through all possibilities. And so if we look at kind of what are the possibilities for this, so the fixed image is our reference, the moving is quite clear, it's what we're taking and trying to transform to match it. The transformations have a lot of open-endedness to them. So kind of the simple transformations like we did were just translation, so just moving in X and Y or X, Y, and Z. But of course you can scale. So if you're looking for dogs in an image or something like that, then it doesn't matter if the dog's small or large. You'd want to be able to find it independent of its size, and so you might need to add some of sort of the scaling transformations. Deformable, so if you look at like someone's lungs, the lungs don't always have to be the same size, and so you can make lungs larger and smaller. Shearing, rotation, different perspectives, all of those things you can kind of incorporate into your transformer to get the best result. Then the kind of interpolator is where you take your transformation and apply it to the input image. And so, a very simple approach would be to take a nearest neighbor kind of resampling of your image. But if you wanted to sort of incorporate more complicated features, then doing sort of bilinear, bicubic, or fully spline-based interpolations would allow you to get sort of much better resolution on your output. Then sort of the metrics. This is, mean squared error, correlation factor, and those are kind of the basic ones. This can lead to sometimes bad matches, depending on sort of the noise or uneven illumination that can cause the image intensities to be very different. And then we have things like the SSIM similarity metric. So if you remember from the third lecture, I think Anders introduced this metric as a way of evaluating how similar images were. And so it wasn't just looking at the difference or multiplying two values together. It was actually taking the sort of features that you would see in the image and making sure that those features were the same. And so it was a more complicated metric, and it's obviously more difficult to compute, but it gives you much more information on how similar the objects actually are. And then finally, kind of the optimizer. And so this is where you take the output of your metric and you decide how to sort of improve it. And so the kind of standard approach for this is sort of some of the things we've mentioned a little bit before, is this idea of gradient descent. And that's sort of how you would, kind of like the watershed method or so, where you would take the path that seems to improve your metric the most. And so you'd start off with a point, you'd sample a little bit in every direction, and then you would pick the direction that would sort of improve the metric you're trying to improve the most. And that's kind of the simplest approach. You have more complicated approaches like sort of atom or stochastic gradient descent or attograd or attadelta, where you kind of incorporate more information on, which direction did you move before, and how can you kind of make a better choice on which direction you move now so that you don't end up missing kind of the local maximum. And so if you're interested, there are gradient descent field. There's certainly tons of images of what gradient descent should look like and how it works. I think but yeah, this is anyways sort of keeping track and trying to sort of descend so that you get to the lowest value based on where you were. And this is then starting to overlap quite a bit with machine learning and other sorts of approaches, and you'll see that a lot of those tools can be incorporated here as well. And so what you'll see is that you have kind of this fixed reference image, you'll have this moving image, and then you'll end up having a very iterative approach. And so you'll pick a set of parameters, you transform your fixed image or your moving image, and then compute your metric, and then calculate a new set of parameters. And that you kind of go through this loop many, many times. And this is just showing what it would look like for 6 iterations, but of course it could be hundreds of iterations. And that's why tools like ITK exist. Because if you're doing something for thousands or 10,000 iterations, you need it to be very, very quick and efficient. And so languages like C++ make it possible to do those optimizations really well so that you can go through a lot of iterations quickly and you can have sort of tightly coupled pipelines for doing this. Similarly, you can have kind of grid searches where you look through a large number of different parameters and then find the maximum values for those parameters. And so that's sort of what we did before, where there was no feedback loop. You just had a huge number of different parameters you gave as input, and you calculate the metric for each one of those parameters. And so here we sort of have our simple example with sort of T0 and T1. And for us, it's quite evident that the T1 is just sort of shifted over and shifted to the right. And now we want to figure out how we can sort of align those together. So we have a bunch of code here that we'll skip over because it's not that important. But sort of the basic approach we'll start off with is using Tensorflow to do this. And so Tensorflow is usually used for deep learning, but actually for any optimization problem where creating an efficient graph is important. Both Tensorflow, PyTorch, and ITK are very well suited for these kinds of problems. And so what we can have here is you can visualize just like we did before. You have your fixed image, your moving image, your transformer, an interpolator, Should be. And then your transform parameters and your metric. For some reason, I guess maybe there's too many things inside. Oh, yeah. Okay, so if you open up all the components, you can see that there's lots and lots of things inside that sort of make up your whole transformer thing, but we have it all collapsed as sort of a single block. Because the browser didn't like that very much. But you should be able to go through that yourself and sort of explore around how that looks. And so the first one we do are sort of the TensorFlow based one where we have this model and you can expand the nodes and see how everything fits together into sort of one graph that we then optimize. We can then run the optimization on our images where we shift the images around and we can keep track of sort of this mean squared error. And so by putting the images in and having it try to optimize, we see that the mean squared error initially gets worse and sort of continues getting worse. So that for this particular problem, using the tools we have and the step size we have, it doesn't do a very good job. We can now sort of tweak the model so we can allow it to sort of transform the images more and focus on just a region of interest. And now we see that the mean squared error goes down to a certain point, but then stops improving. And so it doesn't shift around the images very much, and we don't get to the ideal match. And so one of the problems that we run into is when you do this sort of gradient descent, you need to give a smoother gradient to your image. And so if we go back to sort of this example, if you're doing gradient descent and you're here, it's quite easy that this is a lower value than here. But if you're doing gradient descent from a point like this, you know, this is 22.7, this is 25, this is 26, this is 22.3. You know, your gradient descent would take you in the wrong direction. It wouldn't take you to this point, it would take you down here. And so that's one of the kind of limitations of using sort of too simple of methods or using gradient descent, is that if your gradient doesn't tell you or doesn't point to the area you're trying to get to, then your model won't converge. And so it's important that you have gradients that make sense for your image. And so if we were to start here, you know, we would see the point, we'd go to gradient descent, we'd end up here, and then we'd end up here, and then it would say it was done because it found the maximum, even though the maximum was over here, but because it was uphill in every direction, it would say it's done. And so that's one of the kind of limitations you have when using these approaches, is that you need to configure the parameters well so that it doesn't get stuck in one of these kind of local maximum areas. And so here we see that it kind of drops and then it gets stuck because there's no gradient leading to an increase. And so what we can do is we can use some of the techniques we've covered before to make a smoother gradient. And so by making the image a distance map instead of an image, we end up with much smoother gradients for improving the registration. And so the distance map allows sort of small overlaps to be better than not overlapping at all, and not quite as good as big overlaps. And the problem we have with this is that it's not really a good result until everything is perfectly matched. And so by using the distance map instead, we see that it's able to do a much better job of sliding these objects over each other and converging towards a good result. And so by making those gradients much smoother, we're able to get a much better improvement of what we're doing. And that's the same result that we had with this, where you kind of see, if you're doing gradient descent and you start off here, you might get stuck. But as soon as you're in a region like this, it's quite clear that any point here would see that that was the minimum that you should go towards. And so that's why a lot of these other techniques are quite helpful, because performing a distance map transformation first makes the gradient a lot easier to follow, which means your tools are a lot more likely to work well. Similarly, we can use better features like SSIM, where we can take the SSIM score on the raw image and get a model that does a much better job of converging. So we see that there's still a little bit of instability, so it doesn't always go in the right direction, but that it moves towards the optimum value because the SSIM is a much better indicator of where the maximum is and has a much smoother gradient than just using mean squared error for this problem. As I mentioned, sort of ITK is one of the standard tools for doing this, and we can perform the exact same analysis using ITK, where we have transformations. The optimizer, here we use sort of mutual information, or mean squared error is our metric, so you can pick the metric there as well. And that you can now run it, and it does 29 iterations very, very quickly, and it sort of gets, again, stuck in this sort of local minimum that we had before, but still does kind of a reasonable job. And so in the exercises, we'll have the exact same problem with the NIH X-ray images, where you can use OpenCV, ITK, PyTorch, and Tensorflow, and maybe even standard scikit-image to try to solve the same problem. And so it will show you how all these different tools work and how you can try to apply them to actually solve a problem. Kind of the last thing we'll cover, or we can actually leave the feature points for next lecture. So we have some sort of starting on this idea where instead of actually shifting images around, we just track points through an image. And so here we try to track points and match features in images, and one of the exercises will go into that. But I think we'll start the next lecture with the feature points and just leave it at these sort of ITK optimization approaches for now. So are there any questions on this? Yep.
This system, if I see correctly, works when a shape is consistent.
Yeah.
So if there is something slightly changing over time for growth,
yeah,
it won't work. Right?
Well, it can still work well, but you'll probably want to make sure you have the right sort of features in your image. And so with like the distance map transformation, a slightly larger object still matches up quite well.
Yeah.
But the actual image overlap might be very poor. So you'll want to make sure the transformation kind of makes sense so that you can map the images together reasonably. And also, if you perform things like the affine transform, you can quite easily scale the images. So if everything's growing, then you can learn that quite well. Then, of course, for really extreme cases where lots of things are changing at the same time in your image, I think one of the... So the X-ray scan registration does have these kind of problems in it. And so yeah, so here we have Torch, OpenCV, Simple ITK, and TensorFlow doing the same problem. And so here it's about registering all of these different images together. And so we want them all to be on the same axes. And if you just kind of try to overlap them, it's a pretty bad match that, things shift, the body rotates. And the OpenCV approach, tries to create key points, which is what we'll cover in the next lecture, and match them up together. Here it doesn't do a very good job because the key points in images that don't have edges are quite hard to find. And so when you try to register it, it ends up kind of making a mess of things. Simple ITK does a slightly better job, where you can actually get a sort of deformable registration of your image. And so here you're able to actually move different parts of the image different distances in order to get a better result. And then there's all the other approaches that you can go through to try to get the best matching up of these images. And if we look here, there was a model. That's a voxel morph. That was it. So this was a fairly cool model that I'll add to the exercises as well. From Mass General Hospital, I believe, where they sort of published this paper where they were able to use neural networks to actually perform registrations between images. And so not just using TensorFlow as an optimization library, but using neural networks to take images. Here they had sort of brain examples, and they were able to train a model that recognized how you mapped two images together. So you gave it two images as inputs, and it would tell you how to map them together. And so here you can sort of visualize this 3D field of deformations that it learned to map so that you can take one image and warp it to match another. And so what this was quite useful for is that when you have brains, it's very helpful to have the atlases of the brains where you have each region marked. And so all of these are kind of different important regions of the brain. And doing this for an image is very time consuming. But if you can register or warp one image to the original image, then you can apply that same transformation to the atlas and get where all of the regions of your new brain were. And so here they used a model that they had trained on thousands of scans that was able to then take an image and immediately warp it from the old one to the new one. And so it's a quite interesting technique where you can actually have not just the sort of optimizer for your transform, but learn the actual transform itself, where at each point in the image, you predict how far it has to move in order for the sort of moving image to map to the input image. It's also quite nice because once the model's trained, you can do this instantly. You don't have to perform iterations anymore. You can just perform one-shot analysis to do that. But I can add that to the slides. Yeah, so are there any other questions on that? And so yeah, so I'll add both of those, the registration tutorial and the other example for this, because both of them are quite helpful to look through to get a better feeling for how some of these techniques work on different kinds of data sets. And then the exercises have a few things in KNIME, and then a number of Kaggle kernels where you have like real data sets that you're trying to perform registration and alignment with, and you use various tools that we've covered for doing that. So if there's no more questions, you can start